You always remember the bad guy. These were the words of the late David Prowse, the man who physically portrayed Darth Vader in the original trilogy, and it's kind of ridiculous just how right he was. About a half-century later, Darth Vader is just as iconic and instantly recognizable as he was when he first power-walked into frame to his own theme song. Since then, a mind-boggling amount of content has been created featuring the Dark Lord of the Sith, explaining near enough everything about him. On that note, let's talk about how Anakin Skywalker takes a dump and all manner of fascinating things the films fail to mention, shall we? Just before we get back to the deep dive into Darth Vader's bodily functions and his questionable life support suit that does a rather crappy job of supporting his brain functions and, as we'll get into, all by design of the Emperor leaves him struggling to focus, if you feel like your brain function and focus is likewise lacking, enter Magic Mind Shots and their latest edition in gummy form. Now, as I mentioned about a year ago when Magic Mind first offered to let us try their product, which my wife and I have been using ever since, normally we turn down most nutrition supplement sponsors, despite me being a huge fan of the right ones, simply because most are not third-party tested, the industry is so unregulated, and quite a lot don't really do anything when you really dive into the studies, as our research selves are wont to do. But Magic Mind is one of the exceptions, as they are third-party tested, source their ingredients from some of the most reputable suppliers, and there are literally hundreds of studies in support of each ingredient they include. And when we requested validation on all of this, among other things, they sent over a 63-page document outlining many of them and why each ingredient was chosen, which we looked over closely. We also like that Magic Mind has a no-risk, 100% refund guarantee, no questions asked within 100 days of buying. So if it ends up not being your cup of tea, you're not out anything. Now, when talking about their new gummies, it turns out they wanted me to show you how many gummies come in a bag. But my wife and I had already mowed through almost all of them by the time we found this out, and now no time to get more before needing to record. So, yeah. I mean, we have a few left, this amount precisely. But if you're wondering, it's a 30-day supply for one adult human, which is 90 gummies for 30 days of improved focus, and again, without any caffeine, which is great for me as late-night work sessions are a constant. And packing things like organic ashwagandha, lion's mane, and cordyceps mushrooms, L-theanine, and much, much more. In all, a compilation meticulously designed to promote better focus, reduction in anxiety, and to help with alertness and productivity, all without the caffeine crash, jitters, or interfering with sleep. Plus, they're super handy to pack on the go and safe for kids, making them a great alternate to sugary snacks before school or homework time for aiding in their own focus. If all this sounds interesting to you, Magic Mind gummies are officially live, and if you go to magicmind.com/todaygm or scan the QR code on the screen, you'll get a 25% off launch discount on them and support our work at the same time. It's win-win. Now let's get back to Vader and his comically horrible suit that left him in constant agony, insanely vulnerable to anyone who could press buttons or shoot lightning from their fingers, and had him eating his own poop. Now before we get into the pooping thing, we should probably mention when Disney bought the rights to Star Wars, one of the very first things they did was show a shocking lack of organization and planning via turning their $4 billion investment over to two directors who had wildly different ideas of where they were going with the story. More pertinent to the topic at hand, though, one of the other first things Disney did was establish a sort of core canon for Star Wars via throwing out an amazing amount in the process. While this move has been criticized by some, the sheer volume of Star Wars content created prior to Disney's acquisition, some others have argued made this necessary. Not to mention George Lucas's famed laxity with the brand resulted in a lot of conflicting information that would have no doubt resulted in endless headaches for writers trying to craft a new story within the universe. We'll have a rather amusing story on Lucas's bizarre process for creation that resulted in all of this in the bonus facts later in the video, along with a lot of other interesting Star Wars tidbits. But in a nutshell, basically everything Star Wars related published prior to April the 25th, 2014 is considered part of what Disney refers to and rebranded as Star Wars Legends. The exceptions to this being the original trilogy, the prequels, and the seasons of Clone Wars TV show Lucas himself was a producer on. As a result, when discussing the mechanics of the Star Wars universe, it's important to clarify whether you're referring to the Legends or current canon, and annoyingly, the current canon doesn't explain how Darth Vader voids his bowels for some weird reason. The Legends canon, on the other hand, being rather legendary, absolutely does. As a result, most of what we're about to say isn't technically canon anymore. However, it is interesting if you enjoy Star Wars, and we here at Today I Found Out will be cold in our graves before we cease to acknowledge certain elements of the classic expanded universe as anything but canon. So to begin with, after the injury sustained on Mustafar in the duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi, for all intents and purposes, Vader became wholly dependent on the self-contained life support system that is his suit. This suit takes care of all his bodily needs, essentially replacing or subsidizing most of his internal organs and taking care of Vader's breathing, heart rate, eating, and yes, even pooping. Specifically in The Dark Lord Rises, which thankfully is a mainstream book and not the title of a Rule 34 Vader video in certain darker corners of the internet, it's noted that Vader's suit possesses a smattering of devices to deal with both solid and liquid waste. In particular, a catheter and devices described as recyclers. Both of these systems have caused endless arguments among fans about their exact function and what it means for Vader as a character. For example, going back to Rule 34 in The Dark Lord Rising, does Vader still have a dong, and does he eat his own poop? To explain, while the inclusion of a catheter might suggest Vader still has a penis, technically a penis is not necessary to have one fitted, and numerous bits of extended universe material discuss how the Emperor purposefully neutered Vader's capabilities by making his suit a piece of crap. Metaphorically speaking. More on this later as well. Thus, some posit it stands to reason that the Emperor would literally neuter Vader by slicing off his wang while reconstructing his body. Presumably not personally, you understand, but we're guessing the Rule 34 area of the internet probably has something on that as well. Likewise, you can imagine the same lava that melted off his face also seared his organic lightsaber beyond repair anyway, though presumably now incredibly ribbed for her pleasure. Either way, having lost the use of said appendage, it is no wonder he was so grumpy all the time, and with all that pent-up frustration, constantly going BDSM choking on all his subordinates. Similarly, the use of the descriptor recycler in regards to the device that handles Vader's waste seemingly implies Vader's suit recycles the nutrients in his own poop and then intravenously feeds it to him. For the curious, Vader can eat if he wants to, but it's very painful to do so. But in any event, given only a portion of the poop would have any nutritive value, some have even gone a step further and humorously suggested that Vader's suit, after squeezing as many nutrients out of Vader's poop as possible, will freeze his turds and drop them on the floor, adding that those little cube robots you see scuttling around are part of the Death Star's janitorial service that are programmed to follow Vader around to hoover up his Sith turds. Now, while as alluded to, the Disney canon does not really explain any of this, something Disney seemed to have taken from Legends is the fact that Vader's suit isn't actually all that impressive, with a droid Vader encounters in his comic series noting that no single part of Vader's armor was more advanced than anything located in their own body, and also that all of his life support systems are standard issue, describing the whole thing as junk. Which when you compare it to, say, Luke's hand or Vader's own replaced bits in the prequels, that does check out. However, unlike the earlier Legends canon, which went to great lengths to discuss the poor quality of Vader's suit and cybernetic enhancements to explain away why he's not as powerful as he should be, more on this in a bit later, the new canon focuses more on how much of a threat Vader is despite these limitations. In fact, in one issue of Darth Vader comic, his suit is turned off in an attempt to incapacitate him, and Vader just moves his body with the Force and gets to business anyway. Similarly, some media have noted that Vader can turn off any number of his life support systems, like his breathing apparatus, to move silently for a time, which was done to explain why nobody heard Darth Vader sneaking into the corridor at the end of Rogue One. Finally, having a body that largely uses stock parts found in abundance across the galaxy allows Vader to easily repair his suit on the fly upon sustaining damage, and media in the current canon has showcased Vader scavenging parts from defeated foes to continue kicking butt, or tinkering with his cybernetics to suit his current needs. This is a fun nod to his mechanical aptitude as a child. Also, because he can, Vader travels with a spare suit and replacement for all of his limbs and support systems, just in case. Speaking of Vader depending on his suit to live, let's now talk a little bit about what the buttons on Vader's suit actually do according to Legends. In it, As alluded to, it's explained the buttons controlled the life support system of Vader's suit and that pressing them could almost instantly incapacitate and kill him. This was a detail partially introduced to explain the inconsistency created by the prequels in how Vader fights. Specifically, why he went from Anakin acrobatic style to one that was more carefully and extremely reserved. With the change being explained away by Vader needing to focus on protecting these buttons from being pressed, both by physical attackers and by Force users. In reality, in the original trilogy, Lucas was simply adamant that lightsabers were extremely heavy, and thus the characters needed to keep two hands on the device and movements were much slower and more muted as a result. Obviously, for cinematic reasons, he'd later change his mind in the prequels on this point, and likewise have every Jedi turn into a gymnast. But going back to the buttons, according to such sources as the reference book Darth Vader, a 3D reconstruction log, which goes into detail about the specifics of Vader's armor, the big red button on Vader's chest was a manual override switch which allowed Vader to exert himself more than his suit would normally allow with the proper tweaking of some of the other controls on his chest plate and belt. The blue button located above this red one, on the other hand, returns control to the suit's automated systems. The other buttons on his chest are noted by the book to be programmed touch plates, save for the rightmost red button, which when pressed would reset all of Vader's life support systems, including heart rate regulation. During the reset process, Vader would be more or less disabled for a time and near death while things came back online. So yes, Vader would be easily defeatable by any Jedi via said Jedi simply using the Force to press the reset button on his suit, then sweeping in quickly while he's partially disabled and lopping his head off. As such, in any duel, as alluded to, Vader always had to carefully guard his chest piece above anything else, both with his lightsaber and the Force. Nevertheless, something like this happened in the expanded universe when Antimus Tremaine almost defeated Vader by pressing a button on his chest panel, causing Vader to collapse while gasping for air. Vader also has a belt that has 3 small control boxes on it, with the left one including controls for regulating his breathing manually, particularly handy when trying to sneak up on your son in a dark corridor in Cloud City, or as mentioned, a bunch of rebels in Rogue One. As for the other boxes, the middle one is said to contain spare energy cells and some basic communications equipment for emergencies, as well as audio sensors. The buttons on the rightmost box are temperature controls, allowing Vader to adjust his suit's internal temperature to suit his needs. This same type of environmental control is also found in the Stormtrooper suits. If you're now wondering why Vader's suit has external, very vulnerable controls that could kill or incapacitate him if someone fiddled with them, Vader was curious about that too, and though it's never explicitly confirmed by the Emperor, a popular theory that is echoed by Darth Vader himself in some novels is that, as alluded to, the suit was specifically designed that way to make sure he was always vulnerable. For instance, in the book Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, Vader expressed both confusion and annoyance at the poor quality of the cybernetic implants he'd been given, especially in comparison to much more modern cybernetic limb he had previously had installed after Count Dooku lopped off one of his hands. In the novels and comics where you're granted a brief glimpse into Vader's mind, the Sith Lord makes it clear that his armor is both uncomfortable and ill-fitting, painfully, to quote, snagging on his ruined flesh as he moves. Beyond this, the synthetic flesh they chose to use to replace the old skin is noted to itch constantly. The suit also included needles that were uncomfortably jammed into his head to interface with his mind, and the monitoring panel on his chest beeped frequently and for no reason. Beyond being outdated, the equipment was also conspicuously spotty in its reliability, with parts regularly breaking down and various bits of his life support system regularly on the fritz, constantly reminding Vader of how tenuously he was clinging to life. All this hindered his ability to ever relax or even get anything better than short stints of sleep here or there. This ensured Vader was always suffering from some level of exhaustion to go along with being uncomfortable and having limited mobility, including it being extremely difficult for him to even raise his arms above his shoulder level. Then there was the weight of the suit itself. This was such that one of the few areas of his body that was not damaged after his fight with Obi-Wan, his spine, actually largely had to be replaced over time as it could not support the bulky suit. That's not to mention Vader's boots didn't fit. That's also mentioned in the Rise of Darth Vader novel and is especially hilarious when you consider that Darth Vader does not have legs, meaning the Empire designed custom-made cybernetic limbs and feet for Vader, then somehow, inexplicably, gave him wrong-sized shoes, and then Vader never bothered to correct this despite being himself a mechanical super genius capable of building and enhancing cybernetic limbs. Amazingly, the stated reason for this in legend canon is, and we're not making this up, budgetary limitations, at least according to, at one time, canon reference book about Vader's suit. Remember, this is the same empire that built a moon-sized laser spaceship staffed by a continent's worth of employees that they wrote off when it exploded and then built another one. So maybe Disney wasn't totally off base throwing out some of the former canon. But the short story, in his image, features a passage that described how Vader has trouble walking with his robo-legs and ill-fitting shoes and has to adapt an awkward, plodding gait to move. The story then notes how Vader actually sort of liked how his thundering robotically enhanced footsteps became a sort of precursor to his arrival and decided to just keep moving like that to let people know he was approaching. Even though you'd think a boombox floating behind him via the Force and blasting the John Williams score would do that even better. In any event, in reality, the reason why Vader has such an unusual, exaggerated way of walking had nothing to do with the shoes or crappy legs, but that David Prowse just couldn't move all that well in the suit, and its sheer weight and bulk meant that he had to lean forward as he walked to avoid toppling over. Something fans would poke fun at occasionally, and a writer seemingly felt the need to provide an explanation for. You might be wondering at this point why Vader didn't simply get a more modern suit made for himself that would be more comfortable, drastically less vulnerable to damage, not make him feel claustrophobic all the time, and give him back his old mobility. Such a suit was designed, but unfortunately without the Emperor's help to sustain his life during the transplant of his body from one suit to the other, such an operation would likely result in his death. And even with said help, which would require a great deal of trust in the Emperor on Vader's part, it would have been a risky procedure, so he had to stick with his crappy suit. Because of the limitations and the effects of the outdated suit, Vader was unable to ever truly tap the full extent of his connection to the Force. This was of vital importance to the Emperor, as various sources, like the novel The Last Jedi, the 2013 book, not the other, which we refuse to acknowledge exists, states, even in this weakened, distracted, and permanently exhausted state, Vader was still almost as powerful as the Emperor and could theoretically best him. A final piece of evidence that corroborates this is that Darth Vader's suit was designed in such a way that many of his vital systems were extremely vulnerable to simple electrical shocks. This was revealed to Vader by the Emperor himself after Vader began to chafe under the Emperor's rule. The Emperor made sure Vader knew that anytime he wished, he could use Force lightning to irreversibly damage Vader's life support systems. After learning of this, Vader resubmitted himself to the Emperor and on the side added some electrical insulation to the vulnerable parts of his suit to help mitigate the problem. But it wasn't enough. In the end, it was this vulnerability that ended Vader's life. When he picked up the Emperor to save Luke, even the non-directed Force lightning was sufficient to severely damage Vader's respiratory control system, leading to his death aboard the second Death Star in Return of the Jedi. But not before he tossed the Emperor down a massive shaft of a soon-to-be exploded Death Star, absolutely killing the Emperor dead, never to return again somehow. But going back to Dookie, to sum up, depending on which canon you want to consult, the correct one or the Disney one, how Vader poops is either a process discussed in such exhaustive detail it has led to fan theories he gnaws on poop nuggets for his own sustenance, or is an insignificant detail not worth discussing in favor of showing him strangling aliens with his mind. Then again, as Star Wars writer John Jackson Miller once wryly noted, the thing with legends is that parts of them are true. So hey, maybe Vader really is full of his own crap from continually eating it. Only time will tell. But either way, I think we can all agree it's an apt metaphor for Disney's handling of Star Wars. Now how about some bonus Star Wars facts? Going back to George Lucas's legendary propensity for playing fast and loose with his canon, there's a rather humorous story told by employees of Red Fly Studios who, for a time, were working on a Darth Maul video game that never saw the light of day. They note that before they even got a chance to meet Lucas, they were told by a Lucasfilm rep that they were not allowed to correct him on any details about how the Force worked or say no to him. Second, they were told not to bring up any other Star Wars games, specifically The Force Unleashed or its protagonist, Starkiller. It's unclear why on this one, but we're assuming Lucas didn't want to discuss any of the weird plot points covered in the game. For example, the crux of the whole game is that prior to the original trilogy, Darth Vader had a secret apprentice that could yank Star Destroyers out of the sky with his mind, and had a robot best friend programmed to fight like Ewan McGregor's Obi-Wan. It's really weird, and of course, the author of this script played both it and its sequel multiple times because, heck yeah, Star Wars. In any event, during the meeting, Lucas noticed a figure of another character from Star Wars canon, a female Twi'lek called Darth Talon, who sports similar facial tattoos to Maul, but otherwise had no established relationship with him in any piece of Star Wars media released up to that point. Presumably, this figure had been used by the team for reference purposes and was laid out in the meeting room alongside a bunch of concept art for the game. Not that Lucas cared or noticed. He was too busy imagining a buddy cop adventure featuring the two characters inspired by and combining elements of both the show, Burn Notice, and The Godfather. Specifically, according to people there that day, midway through their spiel about their vision for the game, Lucas stood up, grabbed the figure of Talon, placed it next to one of Maul, and said, "They're friends." After some uncomfortable shuffling, the member of the team with the heaviest iron-laden balls kindly informed Lucas that that wouldn't be possible because the characters were separated by about 170 years of canon. As one writer covering the story would note in coverage of the whole debacle, this was as ridiculous of an idea as Frédéric Chopin forming a bond with David Grohl. Lucas, without missing a beat, shrugged and suggested that they make their character a clone or something. He then suggested they could make Darth Talon act like actress Lauren Bacall, reportedly doing an impression of her to bemused employees of the studio before continuing to play with and observe the figures. Of course, this idea never happened and the game was ultimately cancelled. And now how about a few fun other Star Wars facts? Contrary to C-3PO's estimate in Empire Strikes Back, it would actually be quite safe to fly through an asteroid field pretty much anywhere in the universe. The reality is that objects in asteroid fields are generally hundreds of thousands of miles apart, and most of them are no bigger than a tennis ball. For instance, if you added up the mass of all the asteroids in our solar system's asteroid belt, it's a mere 4% of the mass of our moon, with about 1/2 of the total mass from just 4 asteroids: Ceres, Vesta, Pallas, and Hygeia. So that's our asteroid belt. Could there be one out there that would be dangerous to fly through? This is unlikely unless it was formed extremely recently. The reason being that even if the asteroid belt is initially packed with debris that are colliding everywhere, like what's depicted in Empire Strikes Back, this would relatively quickly, on a galactic timescale, sort itself out with most of the mass being ejected from the belt. Eventually, the system would stabilize itself to something like our asteroid belt. And if you're thinking just now that maybe the Hoth asteroid belt was a newly formed phenomenon, it was actually described in the expanded universe as having been formed several million years before the events of Empire Strikes Back via a collision of 2 rocky planets. For further reference, our asteroid belt is thought to have originally contained approximately 1,000 times its current mass, and within about a million years stabilized down to in the ballpark of the mass we have today. It's also worth noting that objects that are greater than about 6 miles wide in our asteroid belt are estimated to have about 1 random collision every 10 million years or so on average. Not remotely dangerous to fly through. Moving on from asteroids, one individual who had his life changed by Star Wars was James Cameron. You see, a few years after dropping out of community college in 1974, Cameron found himself working as a truck driver. That all changed when he first watched Star Wars in 1977. After seeing it, he decided to quit his day job and see if he could make it in the film industry. A few Oscars and several blockbusters later, we can safely assume he doesn't regret his decision. We can only assume people watching the Disney Star Wars use it as an example of why not to go into the film industry. Next up, the famous Star Wars scream, more properly known as the Wilhelm scream, heard in hundreds of movies, was created by the vocal talents of Sheb Wooley, perhaps better known for his 1958 song, Purple People Eater. The genesis of this scream was that Wooley had an uncredited part in the first film the scream was heard in, a 1951 film called Distant Drums. At one point during the film, Captain Quincy is heading his soldiers through a swamp when one of them gets attacked and dragged under by an alligator, screaming in the process. During post-production recordings, Wooley recorded various vocal sound effects for the film, including a batch of screams. So why was it dubbed the Wilhelm scream if the man who did the scream was named Sheb Wooley? After being plucked from the Warner Brothers stock sound library, the scream was used in the 1953 film The Charge at Feather River, starring Guy Madison as Private Wilhelm. The sound effect is used when Private Wilhelm is shot in the thigh with an arrow. The scream was nicknamed Wilhelm from then on. Moving on, Anakin Skywalker displays 6 of the 9 criteria for borderline personality disorder as defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition. These include frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation in relationships, unstable self-image, impulsivity, that is, self-damaging, inappropriate, intense anger, and stress-related paranoid ideation. On this last, remember, I don't want to hear any more about Obi-Wan. The Jedi turned against me. Don't you turn against me. You're with him. You brought him here to kill me. Next up, ever wonder how they made the iconic lightsaber sounds? Well, wonder no more. Legendary sound designer Ben Burt stated, "The very first sound I created for the film was the lightsaber. In the booth where we projected the films, these projectors would make a hum. They weren't running, they were idling. The motors would just sit there with this kind of magical, mysterious humming sound that I thought was musical in a way, and I thought that's probably what a lightsaber would sound like. And I was searching for some other element, and I had a tape recorder with a broken mic cable that the shielding had come off of, and when I walked past a television set in my apartment, it picked up the hum from the picture tube directly into the broken wire, and that made a buzz, and I thought, that's a great buzz. That sounds dangerous. Normally, a sound person doesn't want a buzz or a hum, but in this case, a buzz and a hum was the answer." Next up, the actor who played Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin, Peter Cushing, stated that he found his costume boots so uncomfortable that he generally did not wear them while being filmed. He didn't go shoeless, however, instead getting Lucas's permission to wear slippers whenever his feet weren't going to be shown in the movie, which is most of the scenes he appears in, just walking around in his comfy slippers. Finally, if you thought General Kree Madding's beard looked false in Return of the Jedi, that's because it was. When Dermot Crowley was originally cast as the General, he had a beard, but shaved it off shortly before showing up on the set of Return of the Jedi. This was a major problem because Kenner Products Toy Company had already began pre-production of the General's action figure, which had a beard modeled after Crowley's former facial hair. To get around this and avoid having to wait for Crowley to grow a new one, he was given a fake beard to wear during filming. Speaking of Return of the Jedi, the return of our sponsor. Before you go, don't forget to check out Magic Mind. Head to magicmind.com/todaygm to get 25% off the aforementioned Magic Mind gummies to increase your focus without the caffeine. Thanks for watching and have a great day.